So picture this, World War II is finally over. The whole world breathes a collective sigh of relief, hoping for some real, lasting peace. But instead, what they got was something totally new, a different kind of war. This one was fought with ideas, with spies and propaganda, all under the constant, terrifying shadow of nuclear annihilation. This was the Cold War, and it was an ideological struggle that would basically define the entire second half of the 20th century.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start in the ashes of World War II and watch as two superpowers rise. Then, we'll dive into America's strategy of containment, feel the tension of the arms race, and this is really interesting. We'll look at the countries that just refuse to pick a side in all of this.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1945, the war has ended, and there's this powerful global feeling of hope, this real desire to build a much better, safer world.
To make sure a catastrophe like that never happened again, the Allies created the United Nations. The big idea was to build something that would actually work, unlike the old League of Nations. A place for countries to talk things out, to handle conflicts before they could explode. It was, a moment of real optimism.
But that optimism, it didn't last. Not even a year later, Winston Churchill gives this speech, and he uses a phrase that just perfectly captures the new, chilling reality. He says, "An iron curtain has descended," and with those words, he gave a name to the stark division of Europe, and this long, tense standoff was just beginning.
So what was this Iron Curtain? Well, it was the dividing line, the ideological battlefront between the world's two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their worldviews were so fundamentally different that they were pretty much on an inevitable collision course.
And listen, this wasn't just some political disagreement. This was a clash over the very soul of society. I mean, look at this. Everything from who owns businesses to who controls the news was a point of conflict. In the West, it was all about individual liberty, free markets. In the East, it was about the collective good, all managed by the state. These weren't just different policies. They were completely different blueprints for how to live. And that set the stage for a global showdown.
The Soviet Union didn't just, suggest its ideology. It enforced it. The USSR basically built a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, taking countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany and turning them into what we call satellite countries. They had no choice. They had to adopt Soviet-style economies and single-party rule. They effectively became extensions of Moscow's power.
So with Soviet influence spreading, the United States had to figure out a plan. A direct war was off the table. Instead, this was going to be more like a global chess match, fought with money, with political pressure, and with strategic alliances.
And the heart of this new American strategy had a name: containment. The idea came from a diplomat named George Kennan, and it was actually pretty simple but really powerful. He said, don't try to fight communism where it already is. Instead, just do whatever it takes to stop it from spreading anywhere else. Contain it. The first big test for this policy came really fast. In 1947, President Truman announced that the U.S. would give military and economic help to any country fighting off a communist takeover. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, and its first use in Greece and Turkey really drew a clear line in the sand. But containment wasn't just about military force. The U.S. knew that countries with wrecked economies were, perfect breeding grounds for communism. So they launched the Marshall Plan, and we are talking about a massive economic aid package, $12 billion, which was an absolutely astronomical amount of money back then, all to rebuild Western Europe.
And the results were just staggering. By 1951, the economies in countries that got Marshall Plan aid had jumped 35% over their pre-war levels. The Soviets' own economic plan, Comecon, just couldn't keep up. You could literally see the prosperity gap across the Iron Curtain, which made capitalism look really good and was a huge blow to communist parties in places like France and Italy.
But this war of ideas soon escalated into something much, much scarier, a flat-out technological race. It wasn't just about winning hearts and minds anymore. Now, it was about controlling the skies, controlling space, and controlling the very power that could destroy civilization. In 1957, the entire world was stunned when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first-ever satellite. That single event kicked off the space race, this frantic competition for technological superiority, but it had a very dark side. Just 2 years later, the Soviets tested an ICBM, a missile that could deliver a nuclear bomb all the way to America. The threat was no longer abstract, it was very, very real. This new reality led to one of the most chilling ideas in all of human history: mutual assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was terrifyingly simple. Both sides had so many nukes that if one country launched an attack, the other would still have enough time to launch their own, guaranteeing that both nations would be completely wiped off the map. It's a crazy idea, right? This balance of terror, this madness, is paradoxically what kept the peace.
But while the US and the USSR were locked in this global stare-down, a huge part of the world started asking a really important question. What if we don't have to choose a side at all?
You have to remember, for all these newly independent nations in Asia and Africa just shaking off decades of colonial rule, the answer was a resounding no. They had zero interest in getting sucked into another power struggle between two new global empires. The idea for this third way really took root at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. Leaders from countries representing over half the world's population got together, and their message was crystal clear. They rejected colonialism in all its forms, and they were going to forge their own path of neutrality, independent from both Cold War blocs.
And this was no fringe movement. We're talking about some of the most influential world leaders of the time championing this idea. People like Nehru of India, Nkrumah of Ghana, Nasser of Egypt, and Sukarno of Indonesia. They really became the faces of this non-aligned movement, giving a powerful voice to the global South.
Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The movement had its own internal struggles. Sometimes, a country's own self-interest would win out over the group's ideals. And honestly, even though they were officially neutral, a lot of these countries still ended up leaning towards one superpower or the other to get a little economic or military help.
So, let's wrap this up. What are the big things to remember? First, World War II totally changed the global power structure, leaving the US and the Soviet Union on top. Second, their ideological fight, capitalism versus communism, became the main event on the world stage for the next 45 years. And third, and this is so important, a huge part of the world said no thanks to that fight and created the non-aligned movement to find their own way.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. The Cold War itself might be over, but those fundamental questions it raised about the best way to run a society, the best way to structure an economy, those are definitely not. So, how do you see the echoes of that great ideological struggle playing out in the world around us right now?